Hello, peace everyone. This is Imaluddin, and this is our third episode of IFRS Masterclass podcast. And in this particular session, we are going to talk about the initial recognition and initial measurement of right of use asset and lease liability. And so, this is a very basic and central topic, central area of concern. And so, we would not want to overcomplicate this with peculiar practical cases. We'll try to keep it as simple as possible because this is an area that affects almost all the companies. And so we'll try to cover it in a way that's conceptually clear and also very tangible to understand. Okay, before we proceed, let me just check whether this live session is indeed live on LinkedIn as well. All right, great. So let's continue with our session. So we'll start with the share my screen first. Okay, perfect. So I hope you can see it now. Um, so initial measurement of right of use asset. How do we initially measure the right of use asset? And as we all know, is some component of the lease liability plus some other costs. So let's dive deep into what these costs are. But first, let's understand when are we measuring this right of use asset. So the thing we need to note is that we are measuring this right of use asset at the commencement date, and which is the date where lessor makes the underlying asset available for use to the lessee. And commencement date is different from inception date. Inception date is where the principal terms are agreed for a lease. And so inception date is where we might figure out whether it's a finance lease or operating lease for the lessor. But commencement date is when it actually the lessee actually receives the asset or the asset is made available for use to the lessee. And there's a difference because if, for example, you discount all the future expected cash flows to or future lease payments to commencement date, it would be different from discounting them back to the inception date if these two dates are different. So it's an important distinction here. Now, what components are built into the cost of the right of use asset? First of all, the foundation of the right of use asset is the initial lease liability, which means all the future payments the lessee is expected to make to the lessor, but all the lease payments basically, and lease payments are defined in a specific way, and they exclude certain kind of payments. For example, variable lease payments that are not linked to index and rate, but we'll come to that later on. So the thing we need to consider here is that initial lease liability is built into the cost, and it is basically the present value of all the lease payments that are not paid at commencement date, discounted using interest rate implicit in the lease. So there are, or in a little boring here, so there are expected cash outflows to the lessee if you think it from the financial terms, and there's a discount rate or rate to use to discount all the future cash flows to the present value. And this is not a market rate of interest. This is something else. We'll talk about it. And so we have the initial lease liability recognition, and initially the value of equal to the initial lease liabilities is included in the cost. And then we have prepayments and incentives. So imagine if you buy something and you pay $10 today and $90 in the future. You cannot simply say that the cost of this asset is $90 because you have also paid $10. So any amount that has been prepaid let's say at the commencement of the lease would also be added to the cost of the right of use asset, because this is literally the cost we are paying. And so even though the lease liability contains only the future lease payments, the asset should also contain the payments that have already been made or are being made at the same day as the lease commencement date. And so we add that. In the same way, if we have received any lease incentives from the lessor, for example, cash rebates, we have to reduce or deduct that from our initial recognition of the right of use asset, the cost at which we recognize the right of use asset. Additionally, if the lessee has incurred initial direct costs, those costs are also added to the right of use asset. Why? Because we are going to benefit from that asset over a longer period of time. And so if we have incurred those costs specifically to obtain that asset, then just like in property plant equipment, when we obtain an asset and we incur some cost to bring that asset to the location and condition, we add those costs to the carrying value of the asset. Similarly, because we have incurred these costs to obtain this asset, these costs would benefit us not just in the current period, but also over a longer period of time. And therefore, they should be added to the cost of the right of use asset and amortized or depreciated over the life of the amortized right of use asset. And so these are the costs that the would not have been incurred if the lease hadn't been executed. For example, brokerage commissions or legal fees for negotiating. And so general overhead or legal fees for leases that fail to execute cannot be capitalized, right? So only those which are incurred only if the lease is executed are these direct costs have been included in the cost of the right of use asset. And then we have restoring and dismantling obligations. So this comes from IS 37. Whenever we have to dismantle a particular asset, we might have to incur, we might have to recognize a provision against it. But as we are recognizing a long-term provision, let's say this asset will be used over 5 years, and after 5 years, we have to pay $1 million to dismantle that asset. So that particular cost that we are going to incur after 5 years should not all be expensed today because we have not incurred it yet, but should also not all be expensed at the end of the fifth year, because that cost relates to the use of this entire asset, right? So we would not simply credit the payment and debit the liability. Sorry, debit the, excuse me. So, for example, if we are incurring a provision after 5 years, a cost after 5 years, we would not simply credit the bank and debit expense. And if you're incurring the provision right now, we would not simply credit the provision and debit the expense today, because expensing it right now or today at the inception of the lease, at the commencement of the lease, would violate the matching principle, because that asset is being used over 5 years, not just today. So that expense should best be recognized over 5 years. And how do we recognize or spread out an expense over a longer period of time? By recognizing it as an asset. So that liability component, which have to be incurred after 5 years, would be built into the cost of the right of use asset and depreciated over time. And so, what kind of cost can these include? This includes dismantling dismantling cost, any cost to restore the site uh, it is located on, or restore the asset to lease conditions. And so, these are the four basic components that are included in the cost of the right of use asset. Now, there are some clarifying notes that we need to be aware of. First of all, we need to add the estimated cost to right of use asset only when the obligation is incurred. So, for example, sometimes the obligation might have incurred at the time of installing that asset, at the time of commencement of lease. And so the contract dictates restoration regardless of use. For example, if when removing physical asset or physical partitions installed on day one is part of the liability or obligation, then at commencement we would have incurred that entire obligation. But sometimes those obligations might arise as a result of the use of that asset gradually, and so we have to recognize them only when they're incurred, or when they become due. Now, we should also note some interactions with other IS. For example, if wear and tear occurs, especially because the asset is producing inventory, restoration costs fall under IS2, not IFRS 16. And secondly, IS 37 is handles the provision side of the dismantling cost, even if irrespective of whether it's capitalized into right of use asset or not. So here's it's a quick formula. How do we recognize our right of use asset? Is basically the initial measurement of lease liability plus the lease payments made at or before the lease commencement date, um, minus the lease incentive received by the lessee from the lessor, plus initial direct costs incurred by the lessee, and we add the estimated costs for dismantling and restoration. So this is a quick overview or quick understanding of how do we initially measure the right of use asset. Now let's dive deep into how do we measure the lease liability. If you have any questions, you can simply ask them in the comments on LinkedIn or on YouTube. I would be checking them intermittently. All right, let's finally move to the recognition of lease liability and how do we initially measure it. Okay, the core principle is that the lessee must measure the lease liability at the commencement date, the date the asset is made available for use. And so, how do we calculate it? We do a present value calculation, which is the measurement based on the present value of all the lease payments that have not been paid yet, because the lease is essentially a financing arrangement. Future payments must be discounted back to their current value using a specific discount rate. And so that's the entire idea. Essentially, what we are saying is that every lease is basically a financing agreement. The lessor pays something in advance to the lessee, and lessee basically pays it back. And so the liability of the lessee is the present value of all the future cash payments it has to make. So that's the substance in the eyes of IFRS 16. That's the substance of the transaction. Now the question is, what discount rate should be used? And the thing is that IFRS 16 does not require a market interest rate to be used, which means IFRS 16 does not require the lease liability to be fair valued, right? But it does not even allow any specific or any random interest rate. It has a criteria of what interest rate is preferred and what interest rate or what discount rate is acceptable. Excuse me. So the preferred interest rate is basically interest rate implicit in the release. And interestingly, this rate is calculated from the perspective of the lessor, even though we are talking about the recognition of lease liability in the books of the lessee. And so this is very interesting. And what this rate is basically, it is the IRR of the lessor. So what return is the lessor making on his lease, and that rate should be used by the lessee to discount his future cash flows. And that's the preferred way. But in practice, a lessee is not in the position to know what IR is the lessor making, and therefore IFRS 16 understand this, the standard setters understand this, and they allow the lessee to use another rate called incremental borrowing rate. But before we move on to IBR, let's first look at what the interest rate implicit in the lease is. So as we just mentioned, it is the IRR, or internal rate of return for the lessor. And what does this mean? It's basically what the lessor is paying today versus what cash flows it is receiving tomorrow, and what rate would discount the future cash flows such that they equal to the fair value of what it's paying today. To make it more clear, let's go to the specific slide that we have on the race. In fact, we're going to have a separate slide for explaining this. Let me just verbally tell you what this is. So interest rate implicit in the lease for is this IR for the lessor, which means that it is a rate that discounts the future lease payments that the lessor will receive plus any residual value guarantee or unguaranteed residual value that the lessor will receive, and the discount, it discounts those future payments to the present value or to the fair value of the asset plus any initial direct cost that the lessor has incurred. So fair, essentially what the lessor is investing today is the fair value of the lease asset plus the initial direct costs. This is what the lessor is investing today, and what it's getting in the future, it's getting in the future lease payments, plus it might get its asset back at the end of lease term. And so the value of, or the residual value of that asset might also count towards his future returns. And so this is the interest rate implicit in the lease, if that makes sense to you. And what is IBR? IBR is what interest rate would the lessee incur if he was to borrow a similar, borrow from the bank for, or borrow from other lender for a similar asset. And so we'll go into detail, what does it mean, what does similar asset mean, and what conditions, what additional conditions there are. But to just summarize the definition for you now, the interest rate the lessee would pay to borrow funds for a similar asset over a similar term with a similar security in a similar economy. So these are four conditions for similarities, and if those conditions are fulfilled, that rate is called incremental borrowing rate of interest, and it's usually a hypothetical rate because lessee has not, is unlikely to have recently incurred into a similar transaction, and therefore lessee will expect or calculate or contemplate what the rate should be. Okay, now it's a very interesting discussion of what these lease payments are. Now, we all know this includes contractual fixed payments. For example, if you're renting a property, you may have to pay $1,000 every month, $15,000 every month, or every quarter, every year. So these are fixed payments which are predetermined as per the contract. And even if, let's say, you have payments that might increase after every year. So let's say your monthly rental may increase by 10% after 12 months, and after 24 months it may increase further by 10%. Those are also called fixed payments because they have been predetermined at the time of the contract. But these also include in substance fixed payments. Some in substance fixed payments are essentially that look like variable, but in substance or in reality they are fixed. And when we are calculating lease liability, we have to deduct any lease incentives that are receivable from the lessor. For example, if there are any discounts or rent-free periods, those future cash flows should not be included into the present value, and so those things should be deducted. So first component is the fixed payments. The second component is the variable payments, but most variable payments or several kinds of variable payments are not included in the present value of lease liability. And so we need to understand which variable payments are included and which are not included. So which are included are basically those which fluctuate based on a index or a rate. And so what exactly these index or rates might be? These might be inflation index. For example, if a contract says that at the end of each year or after every 12 months, the monthly rental or the quarterly rental would increase by the change in CPI or consumer price index or any other inflation index over this period. So if, for example, today the CPI is 110, it goes to 115, and so the percentage change in the CPI index might would affect the future rentals or future agreed rentals for that property. And so when we have these rentals linked to these index or rates, or rate might be a LIBOR or KIBOR or any central interbank offered rate. So when these lease rentals are linked to these index or rates, those payments or those variable payments are also included in the calculation of lease liability. They are not excluded. And so we have to initially measure using index or rate exactly as it stands on the commencement date, and we do not forecast the inflation rate. So in accordance with IFRS 16, we do not have to predict what the CPI would be in the future. Rather, we use the current CPI to discount all the expected future cash flows. And at the end of, for example, every year or whenever the payments are reset, we look at the CPI again or index again, and then we recompute it. And so this is this is a tedious problem to calculate. And to solve this problem, I've also created a tool specifically to automate all the aspects of IFRS 16 lease accounting, and which includes, by the way, this index adjustment or the adjustment of variable payments based on index and rate. If you're interested to look at it, you can go to FYINNCIL financial.com and you'll find it there. Uh, what other components of lease payments do we have to include? First of all, we have talked about the fixed payments, we have talked about the variable payment, but there are some contingent payments, which means, or optional payments, which means they would be incurred only if certain option is exercised, which are basically purchase options. So if there's within the lease contract, if the lessee has an option to purchase the lease asset at a particular price, uh, then that option requires a payment to be made. But only if it's reasonably certain that option would be recognized or that option would be exercised. Only then the lessee would include purchase option payments or the purchase price or exercise price in the lease payments and make it a part of the lease liability at commencement of the lease. By the way, similarly, termination penalties, if the lessee is reasonably certain to terminate the lease before the lease term, then it would include that termination penalty, if there's any, in the lease liability, in the lease payments, but exclude any expected or contractual lease payments after the termination penalty, because in this reality or in this scenario, we are reasonably certain that all the lease payments up to the termination penalty would have to be made, and because the penalty would be paid, any future lease payments would not be included in the lease liability. But remember, these options are based on the assumption that lessee is reasonably certain to exercise that option. And that reasonable certainty often comes from economic substance of the transaction, which means that if, let's say, it's the purchase option, let's say, have a purchase price or an exercise price that is, let's say, significantly lower than other than the price of that asset at that particular condition at that time, um, then that would be available in the market. So a lower than market price would mean that the lessee would be reasonably certain to exercise that option. But the problem here is that in the future, let's say if the lessee goes into a serious trouble in his business and is forced to close that business, then despite being reasonably certain at the commencement of these, somewhere in the future, the lessee might think that no, we are no more reasonably certain. In fact, we know that we will have to close our business, which means we would not purchase the asset. And if these kind of reassessment happens, these are not called modifications, these are called reassessments. And so these also have to be recomputed based on what the new trajectory of future cash flows is expected based on the existing contract without any modification. And if you have such kind of reassessments, our tool which I created for automating IFRS 16 also automates the calculation of reassessments under IFRS 16. And then we have residual value guarantees. So if the lessee guarantees the asset's end of lease value, include the specific amount expected to be paid out to meet that guarantee. Which means, by the way, that lessee is not responsible for any guarantee that the lessor will receive from other sources, and the lessee is not responsible for unguaranteed residual value that the lessor might gain, gain or get from selling that asset somewhere else. Which means residual value guarantee is what essentially the lessee expects to pay to the lessor. And the thing here is that this is a guarantee. This is not a certain payment, which means if, let's say, I'm guaranteeing that at the end of the lease term your asset would be sold for $100,000. Let's say it's not sold after the lease term at $100,000 and it's sold at $90,000. Then the lessee would have to pay the difference, $10,000. If it's sold at $50,000, the lessee would have to pay $50,000 to make up the difference. And so this amount, therefore, cannot be fixed in many cases. And in that case, we are talking about the expected payment, expected amount of payment to be made to the lessor rather than the any contractually fixed amount. And so if, let's say, over the course of the lease term, this expectation changes. Let's say previously we were expecting the to pay the lessor only $10,000, but we now have used the asset too much, and it has probably been partially damaged to the extent that we now know that we have to pay not just $10,000 but $50,000 to the lessor to make up for the guarantee. And so if that is the case, we would have to again, reassess the lease contract, and so the lease liability would be adjusted and the right of use asset would be adjusted accordingly. But that's an advanced topic. All right. So what are variable payments? So we talked about the payments that are included and that are not included. Let's just clarify them quickly again. So to summarize them, uh, so under IFRS 16, the lessee includes in the lease liability only variable payments tied to index or rate, which may include payments linked to a consumer price index or inflation, payments linked to a benchmark interest rate, payments that vary to reflect changes in open market and rental rates. Now, what kind of variable payments might be excluded? If let's say you have a retail outlet on an airport wants to uh, rent it out to you against a rental plus a percentage of your sales. In that case, the percentage of the sales is a variable portion of the lease payment, and that is the kind of portion that is not included with the lease liability. And so, to sum it up, variable payments tied to performance or usage. For example, retail store paying percentage of sales or paying based on machine hours used are excluded from the initial lease liability. They are simply expensed in the period they are incurred. And so the treatment for variable lease payments that are not linked to an index or rate is that whenever they are expensed out in the month or in the period in which they are incurred. So I hope this clarifies the initial measurement of lease liability. Let's just quickly go through the checklist of what is included in the lease liability and what is not included. So first, what's included in the lease liability is basically the fixed base rent, which is the rent we are all familiar with. What's included is also the variable rent tied to an index or rate. Um, but this is calculated based on the commencement levels, and we are not predicting the future inflations. Third, expected payouts for residual value guarantees, or of course, and fourthly, purchase options prices if reasonably certain, and early termination penalties if reflects early termination or whether it's and when it's really certain. So, and what is not included in lease liability? Payments directly made on or before the commencement date, because they have been made. The payment that have been made are not a liability; they are prepayments, right? And so, even though they are included in the lease asset, as we discussed before, they are not included in the lease liability. Second, variable rent tied to sales or usage. As we mentioned, that these kind of variable payments, which are not linked to index or rate, are expensed out when they're incurred and not included in the lease liability. And thirdly, non-lease components, for example, maintenance, cleaning, or unless they've been combined in a way that they cannot be separated. So non-lease components are not included in the lease liability. And so that was a quick conceptual overview of how do we understand or calculate the lease liability or initially measure the lease liability. And so we have gone through the initial measurement of both the lease right of use asset as well as the lease liability. Now let's have a look at how do we calculate or what exactly are the discount rates that we use. We have gone through them conceptually verbally, but let's have a look at how what it looks like in practice. So let me share my the next slide, which is on IFRS 16 discount rates. Okay, so as we discussed, we have two discount rates for the lessee. The lessee can either use interest rate implicit in the lease, or it can use incremental borrowing rate of interest. Now, note that for the lessor, we do not have this choice. For the lessor only has to use the interest rate implicit in the lease. The lessee has this choice, and Even for the lessee, the preferred rate is the one used by the lessor, which means interest rate implicit in the lease, and there's a primary choice, but there's a fallback option, which is often used in practice because the lessee does not know the interest rate implicit in the lease from the perspective of the lessor, or to say it in a simpler words, the lessee does not know the IRR of the lessor. And so the lessee would have to use the incremental borrowing rate of interest. So conceptually, what exactly is the interest rate implicit in the lease? It's basically the lessor's IRR, as we discussed. So the the present value of what the lessor gets should be the sum of equal should be equal to the sum of what the lessor is investing, and that's what IRR does. IRR is a discount rate that makes the present value of the returns received by the investor equal to the investment the investor has made today. And so if we say that investment that has been made is basically the fair value of the right of use asset and the initial right cost incurred by the lessor, then the return that the lessor would receive is all the future payments plus the residual value guarantee or unguaranteed residual value, because the asset would be sold at some price, and all of those future benefits would be incurred because the lessor has invested the asset and the costs, to make it very simple. And so what the again to make it more clear, what are the lessor's inflows? These are the lease payments. The future inflows includes all the future lease payment that the lessor would receive, and all the residual value, right? Here we have mentioned unguaranteed residual value only because the guaranteed residual value is by definition included within the lease payments. So we're talking about everything the lessor receives in the future, and the interest rate implicit lease interest rate implicit in the lease is the rate that makes this the discounted value of all of these future things equal to what the lessee is investing right now. And what the outflows are for the lessor, first of all, these are the fair value of the asset, which are the open market price of the leased asset at the commencement date. Secondly, we have the initial direct costs which the lessor has incurred to arrange the lease, for example, the broker fees. So these are the two things that the lessor is investing to get all of these future returns. And so the present value of future returns should be equal to the investment today, and the rate that makes this discount is basically the IRR, or in case of IFRS 16, it's the interest rate implicitly in the lease, and it's always calculated, I'm saying again, from the perspective of the lessor. But for the lessee, there's a practical challenge because the lessee does not know what the IRR of the lessor is. And so it's rarely used. Unless dealing with a highly transparent related party or specific finance leases, these variables are unknown regarding the rendering the interest rate implicit in the lease almost impossible to determine, to readily determine, of course. And so in reality, we use the IBR. So what exactly is the IBR? IBR is the hypothetical rate. It is and the interest rate a lessee would have to pay to borrow funds to buy an asset similar to the right of use asset. So if I was not to obtain, for example, this vehicle, a particular vehicle, let's say a truck, on a lease, rather I would obtain a loan from a bank and buy it instead myself. At what rate the bank would lend me that money? It depends on what the risk-free rate of my country is. It depends on what my credit risk rating is. It depends on what collateral the bank has from me, which would be the same asset which I'm trying to buy. And so IFRS 16 carefully defines the IBRs through four specific criteria to ensure the rate accurately reflects the economics of the specific lease rather than just using the general corporate fact. So there are four pillars to IBR, and none of them should fall off to make it the reasonable rate for calculation in IFRS 16? First of all, it should be for a similar term. We cannot compare a 10-year borrowing rate with a 3-year lease term, because 3-year lease term might have a different rate because because of the yield curve. Secondly, there should be a similar security, which means if I am to obtain a, a loan to buy a truck, I cannot assume that I'm putting shares as a security, or stocks as a security, or gold as a security, because all those things may have different risk profiles, and because of that, the interest rate would be affected if I am not assuming the same collateral or same security. Then the similar value should be considered. So, borrowing a larger amount might incur a higher percentage, and borrowing a smaller amount might incur a lower percentage because of the risk profile of the bank, depending on the size of the company and all the other circumstances. And then the similar economy, which means the risk-free rate and the other market prevailing rates would have to be considered. And so this reflects the lessee's reality, specific currency, geographic location, and a specific credit standing of the borrowing entity of the at commencement date. And so all of these things have to be assessed at the commencement date, and therefore the IBR, once fixed, does not change unless there is a modification. But we are not talking about modification today, so don't worry. What we have to worry about is the IBR has 4 pillars, and all of these things, all of these similarity criteria should be matched for a particular interest rate to be called incremental borrowing rate of the lessee. So how do we do this in practice, by the way? uh, as we said, this is a hypothetical rate. We do not go to banks and ask for quotations for different kinds of transactions or borrowings. What we do is we kind of try to um, calculate it based on certain assumptions. Uh, and so the IBR serves as the practical, highly tailored substitute, ensuring the liability reflects the specific borrowing profit, term, and security of the arrangement. And so what we do is we try to estimated based on what the risk-free rate is, what the credit rating is, and what the collateral risk is, and all those things stacked up make up the incremental borrowing rate of the lessee. I hope this gave you a pretty good insight into what uh, initial recognition, initial measurement of both the right of use asset as well as the lease liability from the perspective of the lessee. We went in detail to describe what components do right of use assets have and what kind of components it doesn't have and why. We went on to describe the all the aspects of what comprise the lease payments that are included in the lease liability and what are not. And then we went on to describe the economic substance of the transaction and what role do these discount rates play in recognizing the liability for the lessee as well as even the lessor. And so in the next episode, I hope we would target another important area from IFRS 16. Till then, um, thank you for being a part of it, and have a great day.